On this particular date that we're talking about, which is Thursday, October 18th, Kennedy is scheduled to meet with XCOM that morning. Prior to the meeting, he's given new information from recent photos taken on more recent spy plane missions over Cuba, and the photos show there are as many as 40 missiles on the ground in Cuba. At this point, Air Force General Curtis LeMay is going to brief President Kennedy and give his recommendation on what ought to be done, and obviously his recommendation is going to be an immediate airstrike on Cuba. Why? Because he does not want the missile launching pads to become operational. The missiles do them no good if the launching pads are not operational. They're not going to, throw them like arrows, right? I mean, they got to have a launch pad. So, LeMay is pretty strong in his feelings that we need these airstrikes because we have to hit those targets before they become operational. Now, I'm going to read to you, and I just want you to listen. The conversation between President Kennedy and General LeMay at this point. Listen and try to understand what they're saying. LeMay says to President Kennedy, quote, "All you got to do is say go, and my boys will get those red bastards." What's he mean by that? Communists, red communist bastards. That's what he referred to them. In other words, all you got to do is say go ahead, Mr. President, and we airstrike, and we get those communist bastards, those red bastards, right? Then he says, President Kennedy then asks LeMay, if you really think this is the best course of action to take, if you really believe this is what we need to do. And LeMay says, quote, "Mr. President, I believe this is our only course of action. America is in danger." What's he saying? We don't have any other choice. They get those missile launching pads operational and they're going to launch on us, or could, and get every city with the exception of Seattle. Okay? He continues by saying, "The big red dog is digging in our backyard and we are justified in shooting him." Okay? Common rule is if a dog comes into your yard uninvited and starts raising cane, digging it up, you go out and shoot him. That's what you did in the old days. He calls it the big red dog because it's the communist dog. So basically what he's saying is Russia is digging in our backyard and we are justified in shooting them. Where's the backyard? Cuba. Okay? Now, this is key. What does he mean here? And he says, "And sir, given your own statements about Cuba, I think a blockade or a bunch of political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a pretty weak response. I suspect many of our own citizens will feel the same way. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." What does he mean by that? "And sir, given your own statements about Cuba, I think a blockade or a bunch of political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a pretty weak response. I suspect many of our own citizens would feel the same way. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." Yeah, we're going to be perceived as chickens against the Russians. If we do a blockade or political talk, it's time to kick ass and take names, right? These guys are putting America in danger. What's the question? When he said, "You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President," President Kennedy responds by saying, "What did you say?" And after LeMay repeated himself, he said, "Well, maybe you haven't noticed, but you're in it with me." His point there being, don't separate you from me. This is a decision we are going to make as a group. Okay? Now, Kennedy's very frustrated by this point. Again, I'm going to continue the conversation, so listen. And he asked General LeMay what he thought Russia's response would be if we attack Cuba. That's a fair question, is it not? He says, "LeMay, what's Russia's response going to be if we attack Cuba?" LeMay responds by saying nothing. No, he didn't say it. He looks at him as nothing. And President Kennedy states, "What do you mean nothing?" He says, "Nothing, because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose." What does he mean by that? Let me repeat that. Kennedy asked General LeMay what he thinks Russia's response is going to be if we attack Cuba. He said nothing. President Kennedy says, "What do you mean nothing?" He says, "Nothing, because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose." What's he insinuating there? Russia wouldn't do anything because if they did anything, it would lead to what? A war, or maybe a nuclear war. Well, Kennedy just kind of didn't believe that. He said to LeMay, he says, "If we kill Soviet soldiers, they're going to respond. I mean, how would we respond? They're going to do something, General. I can promise you that. What's Kennedy think they're going to do if we attack Cuba? What? Very good. They're going to go into West Berlin. And if we have to defend West Berlin, which we will to the death, we're going to end up in what? A war with Russia, which is going to be nuclear. So Kennedy knows pretty, in his mind, that if we airstrike Cuba and invade, their response will be in Berlin. And then we'll be over there defending freedom in Berlin. He's pretty certain. I think he's right. If they have to defend West Berlin, we're in a war with Russia that could turn nuclear. Well, after listening to the military's recommendations through LeMay, President Kennedy kind of thanks the committee and he excuses himself into his office, taking Kenneth O'Donnell and Bobby with him. So he kind of cuts off LeMay. He thanks the committee and excuses himself into his office, taking Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell with him. What was the military's response when he just kind of abruptly ended the meeting and thanked him for coming and went into his office? They were really angry. I mean, they fully expected him to give them the go-ahead for airstrikes and invasion. But Kennedy knows that if he does that, he's going to have to deal with an issue in Berlin. He knows that, and he doesn't want to do that. So, General LeMay, General Taylor, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, that he brought him in from the Truman administration, they're all really quite bewildered and incredibly angry that the President did not give him the go-ahead for the airstrikes. Now, this is where fate kind of hits, because on the books, prior to us ever knowing about the missiles in Cuba, Kennedy already had an appointment scheduled this day with Andrei Gromyko. We talked about him before, and I'll spell it for you because you don't have it on the sheet. And who was Andrei Gromyko, do you think? Soviet diplomat in the United States. He met with Gromyko every once in a while to talk about relations. Just so happened that he had a meeting with him this day. His name is Andrei, A-N-D-R-E-I, Gromyko, G-R-O-M-Y-K-O. So later that afternoon, Kennedy has already a previously scheduled appointment with Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko. And this appointment was made long before any missiles were discovered in Cuba, and it really didn't have anything to do at all with the crisis. And Kennedy wanted to make sure. He did not want to tip his hat, right? But what might he want? What, if you're going into a meeting with Gromyko, knowing what you know, and Gromyko not knowing what you know, what might be a thought process of Kennedy's? I'm going to confront him about the possibility of them ever sticking missiles in there and see how he responds. Because do you think Gromyko knows they're there? Oh, sure he does. I mean, I'm sure he does. So, Kennedy's just having a discussion in the Oval Office. He's waiting for the right time. And all of a sudden, Gromyko suggests that the United States should stop threatening Cuba. Have we been threatening Cuba? We've been threatening Cuba since the Eisenhower administration. The Bay of Pigs was the biggest threat possible. We went in and invaded them, you know what I mean, trying to overthrow, you know, their leader and possibly assassinate him. So we were always threatening Cuba. We didn't like Cuba. We didn't like Castro in Cuba. We didn't like communists in Cuba. So we're always kind of threatening them. And Gromyko just kind of off the cuff says, you know, the feeling is pretty strong out there that the United States is still threatening Cuba. This is where Kennedy takes his shot, okay? What he does after hearing that from Gromyko is he states to Gromyko, now there's no possibility that the Soviet Union would ever put offensive weapons in Cuba, is there? I mean, that worries us. Maybe some of the reasons why we're threatening you, in your mind, is because we're afraid you might put offensive weapons in Cuba. You'd never do that, would you? And Gromyko says, oh no, we would only supply Cuba with non-military assistance. So he lies really right to the president's face. Now, when you deal with people, this is how I deal with people anyway, is if I'm going to give you every chance in the world to hang yourself and try to get the truth. So, if Laramie's in trouble when I was the principal, I would bring Laramie in and say, Laramie, something you want to tell me about what happened at lunch today? Because take into consideration, I probably already know. So if you tell me the truth, dear, then I'm going to punish you to the minimum, but if you lie to me, I'm going to crush you. So anything you want to tell me? Oh no, Mr. Durr, no, I didn't have anything else. Now listen, I'm going to give you one more chance on this thing, Larry. Now take in consideration, I probably already know this. Is there anything you want to tell me about lunch? Oh no, oh no. And I let her lie to me 3 or 4 times and then I crush her, okay? Well, that's kind of what Kennedy did to a point. He continually to repeat this, okay? Gromyko emphasized the Soviet Union would never become involved in furnishing any offensive weapons to Cuba. And although the president knew he was lying to him, he kept a straight face because he didn't want Gromyko to know that he knew about these missiles. And he says again, now, you know what would happen if the Soviet Union ever supplied weapons to Cuba? That would put us in a very bad situation. Oh, Mr. President, I assure you they wouldn't do that. Now, but you get what would happen. I mean, he just asked him 3 or 4 times about any possibility of offensive weapons in Cuba. And finally, Gromyko finally says that the sole objective of the Soviet Union was to, quote, give bread to Cuba in order to prevent that country from starvation. So he asks him several times, and he actually says, well, that's good enough for me. After he asks him all these times, well, Gromyko excuses himself, he leaves the White House, and the president's pretty upset. He's very frustrated because not only has Gromyko assured him that there's no missiles in Cuba, he's also assured him that none of those 26 merchant ships heading for Cuba has any missiles either. In essence, isn't he assuring him of that? Because he said they would never do that. So Kennedy just has kind of set the guy up to a point, hoping maybe he would give him an inch, but he didn't give him anything. So the president's very upset after the meeting. He believed that Gromyko had purposely lied to his face. And after the meeting, he meets privately with Bobby Kennedy and O'Donnell in his office. Okay? So he's not very happy with Gromyko. He's given him several chances to come clean. He hasn't come clean one time. And he not only has lied about the missiles in Cuba, he's probably lied about any missiles on the ships coming to Cuba. We don't know that yet, but it's our assumption that those merchant ships are carrying missiles. Okay? Well, the reason he sat down and visited with O'Donnell and Bobby is because he was scheduled to go on a campaign trip to Chicago on the next day, Friday and Saturday, a 2-day trip to Chicago. And what did President Kennedy want to do? Cancel. But again, Bobby and O'Donnell say, no, that's not going to work, that's not possible. You got to go on as normal, we got to keep the press out. Have they done a pretty good job keeping the press out? They certainly have. Well, besides, the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, this fine man right here, was really expecting and excited that the president would come. Kind of a big deal, don't you think? Even with John Barrasso, Senator Barrasso, calls me and says, hey, I'd like to come in and talk to your class. That's a pretty big deal. I'm kind of proud of that. Kind of puff my chest out. Hey, a senator wants to come in and talk to my kids. Well, Daley doesn't feel any different. You get the president there. Besides, the Daley family kind of thinks Kennedy owes them anyway. They're kind of expecting the president to come because of the help that the Daley family gave him during the election of 1960. That help. Anybody know anything about this story? What were the Daleys kind of maybe tied into a little bit in Chicago? Organized crime, the mob or mafia. And there's stories out there that the Daley family, who had a lot of ties with organized crime and the mafia, had them talk to their unions, because a lot of these unions, Teamsters, etc., had some ties to the mafia there, and they all asked him to vote for who during the presidential election? President Kennedy. And historians will tell you that if Kennedy lost Illinois, he may have lost the election. It was that close, remember? So the Daleys always kind of felt like the Kennedys owed them a little bit, and they were kind of tied in with organized crime. And so old Kenneth O'Donnell kind of started teasing the president. He said, you don't have the guts to cancel on Daley. You won't do it. You won't cancel. You go ahead and cancel on Daley. Knowing that Daley would be very disappointed if he didn't come, and there was a little, it was in jest, but maybe the mob will take care of you if you don't show up. Yeah, that's kind of what he was teasing. And Kennedy puffs up his chest and he says, you don't think I'll cancel on Daley? I'll cancel on Daley. And the next part of the picture of the movie is him in Chicago. So there was a little good-natured teasing. I don't think they thought that, but you'll see it in the video. Well, before Kennedy leaves for Chicago, he gets together with Bobby and he said, listen, you have got to get XCOM together and you've got to come up with a consensus. We're either going to do a blockade, remember McNamara had talked about that, or we're going to do airstrikes followed by invasion. I don't want anybody hinging on anything else. Okay, don't want anybody hinging on anything else. It's one or the other. Why doesn't he want any hinging? Because sooner or later the Soviet Union's going to find out about this. It ain't going to go for secret forever. And if you have not have a consensus, you are perceived as what? Weak. Weak. Okay? So he said to Bobby, I don't want any messing around here. You get that committee to either say, hey, we're going blockade, or hey, we're going airstrikes. And once I get back, I'll listen to what they have to say and make up my mind. But you got to get a consensus. Okay? So, that moves us to Friday, October 19th, the day of the President's trip to Chicago. Who does he take with him? Kenneth O'Donnell is exactly right. Why does he take Kenneth O'Donnell with him? What?
So Bobby can
And what's Bobby going to do? He's going to communicate with O'Donnell so the President knows what's going on. Because what's the President doing all day? Being entertained by Richard Daley. So he takes O'Donnell with him so that Bobby and he can communicate back and forth on whether they're getting a what? Consensus or not. Okay, how's it going? Let's get rolling here. I got to have a consensus by the time I get back on Saturday. So President Kennedy leaves Friday morning for his trip to Chicago. He takes Kenneth O'Donnell with him. And as President Kennedy is spending the day with Mayor Daley, Bobby has called and visited with Kenneth O'Donnell on different occasions. And finally, Bobby calls O'Donnell and says, listen, we've got a consensus for a blockade, but I don't think it'll last longer than today. If we go back into meetings tomorrow, that could switch, or it could end up non-consensus. So what does he want O'Donnell to do? Well, but he's not going to do it unless he's where? The President's not going to say okay from there. The President's going to go, but once they get a consensus, the President's going to go back and listen, then he's the one that's ultimately got to make the decision, right? Which way you're going. So if the consensus is not going to last more than Friday, what does O'Donnell need to do? Then he needs to get the President back to Washington. It's a 2-day trip, and he needs to get him back. So Bobby tells O'Donnell that XCOM has come up with a consensus for a blockade, but the agreement would probably only last that day. The military still really kind of wanting what? Airstrikes and invasion. So Bobby tells O'Donnell that the President must get back to Washington, D.C. as soon as possible before some members of XCOM change their minds from the blockade. Because really, what does Kennedy want? Does he really want airstrikes? Not really. He'd rather come up with a better solution. And I think he thinks this blockade is better. So who does O'Donnell go to announce that the President's got to go back to Washington, D.C.? Who does all that kind of announcing? His press secretary, Pierre Salinger. So O'Donnell goes to Salinger and just says, hey, President's developed a cold. We got to get him back to Washington, D.C. on the advice of his doctor. Go announce that to the press. Does O'Donnell know anything, or does Salinger know anything about this other stuff? No. So what, if you're hearing that and you're the press secretary, what's your thought?
Yeah, right.
What's the cold? How sick is he? I mean, what's the story? What's going on here? Normally, you know, you kind of give me all the details of the President's agenda, what's going on here, etc. So, Salinger, again, who knows nothing about the crisis in Cuba, says to O'Donnell, Kenny, do I get any input around here? Meaning what? I'm the press secretary, don't you give me all the details and I explain that? And Kenneth looks at him and says, yes. How bad it is, meaning the cold, is up to you. That's what he told him. So he can decide on how bad the President's cold was. Okay? So Pierre still's in the dark on this thing. So what does Pierre Salinger do? He announces to the press that the President would be canceling the rest of his visit and returning to Washington, D.C. on, quote, the advice of his doctor. So Kenneth O'Donnell makes it so the President can get back without the press finding out. He tells Pierre Salinger only what he needs to know. You're on a need-to-know basis here. And when Pierre Salinger questions, if you have any input, he said, yeah, you can decide how bad the cold is if you want. But just announce it, we're going home. Okay? So Salinger announces to the press the president will be canceling the rest of his visit to Chicago and returning to Washington, D.C. on the advice of his doctor. That will take us to a long day, Saturday, October 20th. Saturday, October 20th, it'll be kind of a long day. Well, Kennedy gets back from Chicago on Friday night. He meets with XCOM Saturday morning. They talk for hours and finally come to a complete consensus of a blockade. Now, Defense Secretary McNamara does not want to call it a blockade. He wants to refer to the action as a quarantine. Okay? He makes it real clear to the committee that we will not call this a naval blockade. We will call this a naval quarantine. Rachel, what's the difference between a blockade and a quarantine in your mind?
A quarantine is keeping something out, like blockade is keeping something.
Well,
No,
which one seems a little more...
quarantine seems less.
Right, quarantine seems less warlike. Blockade's almost like an act of aggression or act of war. And the last thing that McNamara wants is what? The perception out there that we want to go to war. So he said, you know, we're not going to call this a blockade. Officially, we're going to call this a quarantine. Because a quarantine would not be seen as an act of war, whereas a blockade would be. Now, what's your next question? What's a quarantine? What are we going to do basically? We're going to draw a line in the ocean outside of Cuba, aren't we, and say, don't cross this line? We're going to kind of draw a line in the sand, so to speak, only it's going to be in the ocean. And so McNamara explained, how's this going to work? Here come these 26 ships, what are we going to do?